Every zoo and wildlife facility on Earth is built around the same basic promise: a barrier strong enough, tall enough, deep enough to keep a wild animal exactly where it's supposed to be, engineered with the full weight of modern materials, science, and decades of accumulated institutional experience behind it. Most of the time, that promise holds. But a small number of species have spent decades proving over and over, in documented and sometimes genuinely astonishing incidents, that the barrier is never quite as absolute as the people who built it believed. Some escape with their bodies, working a weak point in a fence or a flaw in a lock until it finally gives. One escapes something deeper than any fence could ever contain, a kind of escape no amount of steel or concrete has ever been able to prevent. Here are 7 animals that captivity has never fully managed to hold, counting down. Number 7 is the red fox, an animal whose reputation for cleverness in the wild translates directly into a documented talent for finding the one weak point in an enclosure that everyone else missed, a habit of exploiting overlooked details that has embarrassed more than one facility confident in its own containment design. Foxes are accomplished diggers and capable jumpers, and wildlife facilities housing them have recorded repeated escapes over the years. Animals working at a single section of fence or a loose patch of ground with a persistence that outlasts most containment efforts, built around the assumption that a fox simply needs to be kept in rather than actively worked to keep in. What makes the species particularly difficult isn't raw strength, it's patience, a willingness to return to the same weak point night after night until it finally gives, probing the same 6 inches of ground long after any less determined animal would have given up and settled for the enclosure it was given. Number 6 is the gray wolf, an animal whose captivity difficulties come less from any single dramatic escape and more from a fundamental mismatch between what the species needs and what any enclosure can reasonably provide, a mismatch that shows up in behavior long before it ever shows up as an actual breach in the fence line. Wolves in the wild range across enormous territories, covering ground that would dwarf even the largest wildlife facility enclosure many times over, and that instinct to patrol, test boundaries, and search for a way through does not switch off simply because the boundary is now a fence rather than a rival pack's territory line. Documented escapes from wildlife facilities housing wolves have involved digging beneath foundations, exploiting gaps left by shifting ground after a hard freeze, and in some cases simply climbing structures that were assumed to be climb-proof, wolves finding purchase on chain link and rockwork that engineers had calculated no canine could realistically scale. Facilities that successfully house wolves long-term tend to describe the work less as containment and more as constant maintenance against an animal that is always quietly testing, probing the same fence line on a rotation that never really stops. Number 5 is the common raven, alongside several of its corvid relatives, animals whose captivity challenges have nothing to do with size or strength and everything to do with sheer problem-solving intelligence, a mismatch that has forced more than one facility to redesign enclosures originally built with only larger, physically stronger animals in mind. Ravens have been documented manipulating simple latches, working cage doors that were assumed too complex for a bird to defeat, and in several recorded cases, appearing to work collaboratively, one bird distracting a keeper while another worked at an enclosure weak point, a level of coordinated behavior that surprised even researchers who already suspected corvids were unusually intelligent. Researchers studying corvid cognition have repeatedly found that these birds approach a barrier the way a person might approach a puzzle, testing, learning from failure, and returning later with a different strategy rather than repeating the same failed attempt indefinitely, a pattern of behavior that puts them in a category most captivity design was never built to anticipate, since most enclosure engineering assumes the animal inside will not actually learn from its own mistakes. If you have ever seen or heard about an animal escape from a zoo or wildlife facility near you drop what happened, and where. Stories like these rarely make national news, but they tend to spread fast locally, and the details are usually far stranger than anything an official report ever captures. The kind of story that gets better and stranger every time a longtime local retells it. Number 4 is the American black bear, an animal whose combination of raw physical power and genuine problem-solving ability has produced some of the most well-documented captivity escapes of any large mammal, incidents that have been studied closely enough by containment engineers to shape how bear enclosures are built industry-wide today. Black bears are capable of manipulating latches, prying apart weak points in fencing, and in several recorded cases, using objects within their own enclosure as tools to reach or break through a barrier that should have been secure, dragging logs or debris to a fence line specifically to gain the extra height needed to clear it. Wildlife facilities housing black bears have had to continuously upgrade containment, specifically in response to individual bears learning and defeating a previous generation of security measures. An ongoing arms race between engineers and an animal that treats every enclosure as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent boundary, a contest that has pushed containment design forward almost entirely in reaction to what a specific bear figured out the season before. Number 3 is the elephant, an animal whose captivity struggles are driven by an unusual combination of raw physical strength and a social, emotional complexity that most containment systems were never designed to account for, a combination that makes the species one of the most expensive and complicated animals any facility can responsibly attempt to house long term. Elephants are strong enough to breach barriers that would comfortably hold almost any other land animal, capable of pushing through reinforced fencing or walls with a level of sustained force few other species could match. And there are well-documented historical cases of elephants, particularly in traveling circus and early zoo contexts, breaking through walls, fences, and restraints that had been considered more than sufficient at the time they were built. But the deeper captivity problem with elephants goes beyond physical containment entirely. These are animals with complex social bonds, long memories, and documented signs of distress when kept in conditions that don't match the scale of movement and social structure they evolved within. Isolated individuals in particular, showing behavioral patterns, researchers describe as clear indicators of chronic stress, meaning even a facility that successfully contains an elephant's body is not necessarily succeeding at containing anything close to what the animal actually needs. Number 2 is the orangutan, and this entry belongs to one animal in particular whose reputation looms over the entire history of captive great ape management, a case study still referenced decades later whenever zoo staff discuss what genuine intelligence-driven containment failure actually looks like. Fu Manchu, an orangutan housed at an American zoo, became internationally famous for a sustained pattern of deliberate, tool-assisted escapes, repeatedly getting loose from an enclosure that keepers had genuinely believed was secure, incidents that continued despite repeated attempts to identify and close whatever gap he was exploiting. His method involved fashioning a makeshift tool from wire, using it to manipulate the mechanism of his enclosure's door, and then in a detail that turned the case from a simple escape into something closer to legend, concealing that same tool in his cheek pouch between attempts, so keepers searching the enclosure never found it, effectively hiding the evidence of his own plan in plain sight every single time staff checked on him. Orangutans as a species are known for exceptional problem-solving intelligence and tool use in the wild, fashioning sticks and other implements to extract food or water in ways that closely parallel basic human tool use. And Fu Manchu's case remains one of the clearest documented examples of that same intelligence being deliberately, repeatedly turned against the very containment built specifically to hold him, a pattern of behavior that eventually forced his facility to fundamentally rethink how orangutan enclosures were designed industry-wide. Which brings this list to number 1, and it is the only entry here that never actually broke out of anything, a distinction that makes its place at the top of this countdown feel almost paradoxical until the full picture comes into view. The killer whale, or orca, has never been documented escaping a marine park enclosure the way a fox digs under a fence or an orangutan picks a lock. Its concrete and steel containment, unlike every other entry on this list, has always physically worked exactly as designed, holding the animal's body inside its walls without a single documented breach in the species' entire history in captivity. And yet no animal on this entire countdown makes a stronger case for the idea that captivity fundamentally cannot hold what it claims to. Orcas in the wild travel enormous distances every single day, moving through complex, cooperative family pods that pass down hunting techniques and social knowledge across generations, distinct pod cultures maintaining their own dialects, hunting strategies, and social customs passed down the same way human communities pass down tradition, navigating an open ocean environment that no tank, however large by human standards, comes anywhere close to replicating. In captivity, that entire framework collapses. Documented physical changes appear in captive orcas that are exceedingly rare in wild populations, including collapsed dorsal fins, linked to inactivity, and the unnatural amount of time spent at the surface in a confined space, a physical marker researchers use almost as a visible signature of the gap between a wildlife and a captive one. Documented behavioral changes appear too, including aggression toward trainers and other orcas, that researchers studying the species argue reflects the profound stress of an animal built for open ocean complexity being confined to a fraction of the space and social structure it evolved to need, forced into artificial social groupings with unrelated animals that would never naturally share territory in the wild. The most widely known case involves a captive orca connected to multiple serious incidents with trainers over the course of decades in captivity, behavior that marine biologists studying the case have directly linked to the psychological toll of that confinement rather than to any inherent trait of the species in the wild, where confirmed aggressive incidents toward people are essentially unheard of across the entire documented history of wild orca and human interaction. That is the real reason the orca sits at the top of this list, rather than any animal that actually broke free. Every other entry here represents a body finding a way past a barrier, a fox through a fence, a raven through a latch, a bear through a wall, an orangutan through a lock. Each case ultimately a story about an engineering failure, eventually meeting an animal clever or determined enough to find it. The orca represents something the barrier itself can never solve, an animal whose fundamental nature, its need for space, movement, and complex social structure, simply cannot be replicated inside any enclosure currently built for it, no matter how secure that enclosure physically is or how many safety upgrades are added to it over the years. The body stays contained. Everything that actually makes the animal what it is does not, and no amount of reinforced concrete has ever changed that basic fact. Every species on this list forces the same uncomfortable question back onto the people building the enclosure rather than the animal trying to leave it. Whether the fence, the latch, the wall, or the tank was ever really built around what the animal actually needs, or only around what was convenient and affordable to construct within a given budget and a given plot of land. Foxes dig because digging is what a fox does, an instinct no amount of enrichment or comfortable bedding ever fully satisfies. Wolves test boundaries, because that is how a wolf has always survived, reading every edge of its world as either safe or worth challenging. Ravens solve puzzles, because that is how a raven's mind works, whether or not there happens to be a cage involved, treating a latch exactly the way it would treat a stubborn food source in the wild. And an orca changes, physically and behaviorally, inside a tank precisely because nothing about that tank was ever built to hold what an orca actually is in the first place, no matter how much the design has improved since the earliest, far smaller pools of decades past. If you want more of these overlooked animal stories brought into the light, subscribe and stay close, because the next entry on a list like this might already be quietly testing the fence closest to you, working the same patient angle a fox or a wolf has been working for longer than anyone watching that fence has actually noticed.